Welcome and thank you for joining part one of Seyfarth's webinar series, California Workplace Violence Prevention Program Requirements. All participants are in listen-only mode, but are encouraged to submit questions throughout the program through the Q&A section located on the right side of your WebEx window. We will do our best to get to everyone's questions. For those interested in CLE credit, an attendance verification code will be read during the presentation. Please write this code down. It will not be repeated and is required for CLE credit. Copies of the webinar recording and presentation materials will be distributed to attendees in the days following the webinar. At this time, I'd like to turn the program over to Adam Young.
Yes, good morning, everyone, and welcome to part one of our two-part series on California's new workplace violence prevention program requirements for general industry employers. The second part is going to pick up on May 9th. My name's Adam Young. I'm a partner with the Workplace Safety Environmental Group in our Chicago office. And I'm here with my colleagues Ilana Murati and Daniel Birnbaum, who are also members of the Workplace Safety Environmental team. It's a national practice across 6 offices. And Ilana, Dan, and I all work in the space of workplace violence and spend a large percentage of our time with California's OSHA state plan, known as Cal-OSHA. It's consistently the most aggressive agency with the newest and most cutting-edge OSHA standards and safety regulations, which is why we're here today and why we do so much work in California. Next slide, please. The program objectives, we're going to explain today what California is requiring with its new law, which employers are covered. We're going to explain what workplace violence is. It's not just mass shootings, it's much broader to include threats and bullying, sexual violence. We'll talk about that as well. And we're going to talk about the general requirements for employers, the training requirements, the record keeping requirements, and how all this needs to get done by July. So let's go on to the next slide, please. Next slide, please. So workplace violence is a hazard that confronts every employer in the United States and every employer in California. Unfortunately, I can think of at least 8 instances that I've been involved with in the last 15 years, helping clients who have had on-site fatal shootings of employees. And those are really just the tip of the iceberg. We've been seeing more and more workplace violence issues and workplace violence work. There's been particularly an upswing since 2020. But whatever changed with our culture with the pandemic has really exacerbated the problem of workplace violence, and we're seeing more and more of it. Federal OSHA has long enforced workplace violence through its general duty clause. It's a pour-over requirement to have a workplace free from recognized hazards. California also has an injury and illness prevention plan regulation, where you have to have this overall safety and health management system. It requires employers to have a safety and health plan, analyze their work sites, implement safety concerns. And that's how they have largely addressed workplace violence in the past. But as I described, we've been seeing more workplace violence, high-profile events in the news media, and the California legislature has stepped in and required workplace prevention plans as well. So not just your injury and illness prevention plan, your IAPP, you also have to develop this workplace violence prevention plan. The due date is July 1st, 2024. Employers must have that workplace violence prevention plan in place. It's a written program with very complex, with many elements. Cal-OSHA has provided a model, and they've provided FAQs or frequently asked questions on how to do it and how to go through it. Some of these are pretty onerous components to this plan that are not commonly used across industries. Training has to be done on the plan. There needs to be an incident log, which most employers outside of the healthcare space don't maintain as it stands now. So a lot of work on the plate for employers in this space in the next couple months. If we go on to the next slide, please. Yeah, a good percentage of Cal-OSHA citations that we see are for programmatic violations about technicalities. So, for example, with heat illness, if you have a work site where you do work outside, California requests the heat illness prevention plan at every inspection where there's outdoor work, and then examines it with a little checklist to make sure everything's in there and issue citations. And that's what we anticipate here. Compliance officers are going to be learning this area as well. They're going to have a checklist to make sure employers have what they need here, and that's going to start in July. California has also been working on its own workplace violence standards, so their own regulations. And we anticipate those are likely going to come out in the next 2 years as well. In the meantime, we have what the legislature has pushed upon employers, which is the requirements to have this plan developed. But even if we comply with the plan and have it done by July 1st, we think there might be some more requirements that we need to be in touch with you all about in the next 2 years. If we want to go on to the next slide, please. I'll turn things over to Alana.
Okay, thanks, Adam. So this law touches just about every employer in the state. There are a few exceptions, but for the most part, it's going to be everyone. So employers that are already complying with Cal OSHA's violence prevention in healthcare are exempt from SB 553. So that's primarily going to be hospitals, other healthcare facilities, congregate care settings, facilities of that nature. That's a regulation that's been in place since 2017. But if you're not covered by that and you're not complying with that regulation, then you'll be covered by SB 553. It's not going to apply to employees who telework from a location of their choosing that's outside the control of the employer. So if you have an employee who's solely remote, works from home, they're not covered. But if you have an employee who even comes into the office 2-3 times a year, you're going to want to make sure that that employee has been trained and that you're compliant with SB 553 with respect to those employees. Because once they're in a workplace that you as employer control, then that employee is covered by SB 553. So you really only want to be exempting employees who are fully remote and working from home, or their local coffee shop. Another exemption is that you're in a small location, fewer than 10 employees working at any given time, and it can't be open to the public. That work site would be exempt. And then Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation and law enforcement is also not covered. But outside of those few exemptions, it's all employers. Next slide, please. So what conduct is covered? As Adam alluded to, workplace violence under this law is much broader than, for instance, like an active shooter scenario, which is something that, some employers already address in their safety program. It's a broad definition. It's any act of violence or threat of violence that occurs in a place of employment. It has to involve some form of threat of bodily harm or bodily harm. That can include, again, not just active shooter or something like a homicide, but sexual assault or threat of sexual assault, fighting, even a verbal or written threat, something like in a text message, if it conveys an intent to cause physical harm, that is going to be included. Intimidation, bullying, even gesturing. If it conveys an intent to physically harm someone, that'll be included as workplace violence. And these definitions are going to be very important, not just so that you understand as an employer, what your plan is meant to cover, but as Dan will talk about later in this presentation, there's a log requirement under SB 553. And you're going to have to log workplace violence incidents. And so it'll be very important that whomever is assigned to maintain that log understands the definitions. You don't want to log things that you don't have to log, and you want to make sure that everything you're supposed to log is on that log. Next slide, please. So the law breaks up types of violence that you need to be thinking about. Importantly, the definition of workplace violence is not just limited to these 4 types. These are included as workplace violence, but workplace violence goes beyond these 4 types. So there's type 1, 2, 3, and 4. Type 1 is an individual with no connection to the workplace. So, a random person comes in and, shoots several employees. That would be type 1. Type 2 is a customer, for instance, or a client who's directing violence towards an employee. So like retail settings, this is frequently the type of violence that we see. Type 3 is employee on employee, also very common. And type 4 is violence committed by a person who has a personal relationship with an employee, but who doesn't actually work at that site. So, think of a spouse or a boyfriend or a girlfriend who becomes disgruntled and comes into the work site to go after their partner. So again, think of these types of workplace violence, but don't limit your plan to these. Another example, something that could come up is, say, two vendors at an employer site who are engaged in a violent act. That doesn't cleanly fall into any of these four types, but that would still be considered workplace violence. Most likely, we'd be surprised if Cal OSHA took the position that that wasn't workplace violence. Next slide. I think I mostly covered this already, but again, it's the threat or use of physical force. It has to result in or have a high likelihood of resulting in injury, stress, trauma. So you don't need to actually have an injury, but if there's fear of injury or even a response of just stress from having received that threat, and that threat included a threat of physical force, that's workplace violence. Also, any incident or threat involving a firearm or other dangerous weapon is going to be included. Animal attacks also considered workplace violence. So, we don't see that as commonly, but it absolutely does come up. So be mindful of that. Even something as simple as like an employee who is making deliveries and is attacked by a dog, that will be considered a violent incident. Next slide. So the plan is like a key component of complying with the law. We don't have an exhaustive list of everything that's required in this plan. Cal OSHA does have a model plan that includes all of the elements that you need to have. We recommend to nearly all clients that they use the Cal OSHA model as a starting point. It's not something that you have to use, and there are certain parts of the model program that contain elements that you actually don't need to have. So you don't necessarily want to just take the plan, complete it, and call that your own plan. It's perfectly acceptable to do so, but if there are areas where you want to modify, take out certain language, that would be fine. But the biggest elements that you need to be thinking about are employee involvement. And we suspect this is going to be a big part of what Cal OSHA is looking for when they inspect is, do you have procedures in place to enable employee participation? We get questions a lot on what does that look like. It depends on the workplace and what you might already have in place for employee participation. Like if you have a safety committee, safety committees are often a great way to weave in development and implementation by employees of this plan. But if you don't have that, another way that you can do this is something like suggestion box. That could even be like an online suggestion box, telling employees that if you have ideas or concerns, click this link on the employee portal, and those suggestions will be considered. You need to make sure that you're coordinating with other employers who have employees who may be on site. So a common scenario for this is temporary employees. The framework to be thinking about this is the same for all other safety matters, really. And it's essentially that Cal OSHA, at the end of the day, doesn't care so much about who does what. But they want to make sure that each employee has been trained and understands their roles and responsibilities for safety. So if you have temporary employees, there's going to need to be some level of coordination with the staffing agency on, who's providing training. If you're a host employer, you want to make sure that maybe the staffing agency has provided some general awareness, and then you'll need to be communicating, site specific training. But you have to make sure that every employee who's working on site is trained. You have to have some means for accepting and responding to reports of violence or concerns, ensuring employees comply with the plan. Again, that's sort of already, you should probably have those elements in place for other aspects of safety. Typically that's like a disciplinary policy, some sort of auditing policy. Next slide, please. And then you have to have certain procedures like communicating with employees about incidents, and explaining how concerns will be investigated. You have to have, procedures to respond to emergencies. A big one is going to be identifying and evaluating workplace violence hazards. Again, this is sort of a similar framework to the IIPP standard. So if you're a California employer, hopefully you're already doing this with issues of safety. You have to do these periodic evaluations of the work site and identify potential hazards and correct them as necessary. So on top of looking for all the other safety hazards that you might already be looking for, you're adding workplace violence hazards to that list now. You want to have a post-incident response investigation procedure, and then annually the plan has to be reviewed. If there's anything that needs to be updated, you're going to need to update it. Next slide. And training requirements, I think, Dan, that's you.
Yeah, thank you, Alana. Appreciate that. So talking a little now about putting the plan into place and doing training, the training requirements are going to be effective by July 1st and will continue annually thereafterwards. And in addition, will be required whenever an incident occurs that would require additional training. In terms of the type of training that can be provided, it's a performance standard. So it's really whatever's effective. And in California, consideration as well is that the training will have to be in the employee's primary language. If English is not their first language or whatever that may be, the training should be communicated to employees in that manner. And the training is to cover the topics that we've generally covered today. And while some of these topics I think are sort of routine or going to be similar for employers everywhere, such as the definitions and requirements of the regulation, certain training requirements are really going to be site specific or employer specific, like how to actually report and call. And as Alana mentioned earlier, and I see we have questions coming in on sort of the staffing employer side or dealing with independent contractors and that sort of situation. The training will certainly have to cover the phone number that needs to be called in terms of either on-site security or staff, or if there's a contact that way, if there's local police officers, and even getting as granular as if a outside access number needs to be punched in on a phone, like pressing the number 9 first before you dial 911 can be an issue. And so those sorts of who to contact and how to actually do it needs to be part of the training. And so if you're not a host employer or you're sending your employees outside, you want to make sure you're coordinating. So either they are providing that training, or if they're not, you get the information and then you can provide that training to your employees. Other sort of employer specific training information would be hazards specific to jobs, or corrective measures that are put into place, how to seek assistance and strategies to avoid physical harm. And I know there's a lot of wiggle room in some of these concepts here. And so some of the value that we can add from our team here is Alana, Adam, and I have all been helping employers of all different sorts of industries in all different sizes, try to come up with the sort of content that would be necessary to fit into this sort of training. So, we see the questions coming in. We will respond to these questions following the webinar. We encourage you to reach out to us. Again, our contact information is included to help generate ideas, no matter how big or small your company is, or how serious or maybe not as serious a concern workplace violence is, so that you can come into compliance with what's required here. In addition to those sorts of topics that need to be covered, there's also the incident log, which I'll talk about here in a moment, an opportunity for questions and answers, and whether that means soliciting feedback from employees or giving a contact information or a suggestion box, even, or a virtual suggestion box, however we want to do it. All things that need to be considered and put into place. But again, a lot of flexibility here. So it just depends on your specific company and how significant the concern is of what you'd want to put into place. The other issue we've seen with some of the clients who have started to reach out to us is this looming deadline of July 1st, which will likely be here sooner rather than later. And understanding that if you need to put something in place quickly, but prefer to do something a little bit more comprehensive down the road or for next year, the training can be as simple as a brief PowerPoint or a handout or even an email, so long as it covers the required elements. And putting that into place can be done quickly. And then if preferred, a more comprehensive or robust training can always be developed and put into place for the next annual training. So some overview there. Next slide, please. Additionally, in terms of just logistically how this works, the training is required for new or unrecognized workplace violence hazards, and just as a matter of employee interface, it's always a good idea to, after an incident were to occur, to let the workforce know that company is on top of any sort of incidents and what the company is doing anyway. So even if it's not required, probably a best practice from an employee relations standpoint. And the training records have to be maintained for at least a year, as well as any employees who work in California must receive that training. Next slide, please. So moving from training, want to talk about recording and reporting requirements. Another new requirement here, some paperwork that will need to be generated. A template log is usually a best approach that identifies all of these categories I'll go over, that can just be handed out to managers or supervisors who then can just fill it out. But the employers are required to record every workplace violence incident on their log. I did see a question about whether those incidents occur off the work site, such as in the field, and if it's part of the course of employment and the employee's duties, that would presumably be covered by this log, which has to include the date and time of the incident, a detailed description of the incident, sort of the who, what, where, when, why. Although with regard to the who, part of the log is that there must be confidentiality and no sort of identifiers of individuals. So job titles or job positions is how the information should be filled out. And a classification of who committed the violence. So whether that's the client, a customer, an offsite third party, an independent contractor, or someone with criminal intent. There's all sorts of different categories of who could commit the violence that needs to be included. The violence type, which Alana made reference to earlier, types 1 through 4, and then consequences of the incident need to be included on the log as well. Again, this isn't a completely comprehensive list. There are some additional requirements, but these are the main overview points of the log. And again, as a best practice, we suggest developing a template that can just easily be filled out, circled, with easy instructions for your field personnel to be able to complete with minimal oversight. In terms of retention, you see a lengthier retention requirement here versus the training. This one's for 5 years. And employees are entitled to view a copy of the log and be provided a copy within 15 calendar days. But again, a performance standard here. So one way to do it is the company can print a copy and hand it to the employee, or if the employee has access to electronic means through working on a computer or as part of their job duties, it could be made electronically. Or another way to do it is to store it in an accessible area where employees can access the information. Whatever the employer wants to choose, but it has to be made accessible and given within those 15 calendar days. Next slide, please. Just one other topic we want to cover on briefly here, which might not be at the top of everyone's list, but it is a new requirement that came out with this workplace violence rule. These new temporary restraining order rules on behalf of employees. So we see a little bit more rights given to the union. Previously, it was just employers who could petition for temporary restraining orders on behalf of employees. The new SB 553 expands it now to include collective bargaining representatives. And then in line with what I was just talking about with the logs, there's a little bit now more consideration of confidentiality for victims. So employee names are now withheld under the law from those TRO papers. And making light to what Alana referenced earlier in terms of the broadening of what's considered workplace violence, the law also expands the actionable conduct now to include harassment. So a broader definition there. It's not just simply violence or threats of violence. Next slide, please. So we've arrived to probably everyone's favorite part, the CLE code, and we have a new process here. So we're going to leave this up for a moment or two so you have time to access your phones and scan the QR code. The code, the CLE code is SS, as in Seyfarth Shaw 6985. So SS, as in Seyfarth Shaw 6985. And we'll leave this up here for a minute or so everyone can access their phones and be able to access the CLE form. Well, hopefully you're able to get your phones out in time. If not, the slide deck will be made available following this presentation. If we weren't able to answer your questions in time, either Alana, Adam, or myself will reach out and contact you, and you will get a response to your question from one of us following this webinar. As Adam referenced at the bottom of the hour, that this is just part one of our series on the workplace violence plan, covering the sort of the fundamentals and basics of the plan. Part two, which will be on Thursday, May 9th, is going to go a little bit more underneath the skin and in depth and advise on best practices and suggestions and guidance on how to comply, not only with getting everything into place, but moving forward on an ongoing basis and ensuring that you're fully compliant with the law without making a administrative headache for your HR or safety team. So we are hopeful that you can join us for that session as well. But if not, we do encourage you to reach out to us if you have any questions or future questions, either on putting this into effect or into practice. But otherwise, we appreciate everyone joining today and thank you for your time. And you will be hearing from one of us soon. So thank you, everyone, and hopefully have a good day.